My name is Jonathan Kaplan. I'm the director of the Schusterman Center for Jewish Studies at UT Austin. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to our talk this afternoon, which I'll turn over to my colleague, Dr. Naomi Lindstrom, in just a minute to introduce our speaker for the day. I just want to highlight we have one in-person event that is currently left on the schedule for the academic semester. I invite you to join us in person on Friday, April 29th in Calhoun 516 at the UT Austin campus, where our Israel Studies graduate fellow, Atalia Israeli Niveau, will be giving a talk entitled From Resistance to Cooperation, Pink Warsh, Trans Nationalism, and Queer Politics in Israel-Palestine. I would now like to turn it over to Dr. Naomi Lindstrom, who is the Gale Professor in Jewish Arts and Culture here at the University of Texas, faculty member in Department of Spanish and Portuguese Studies, and the director of our Gale Collaborative on Jewish Life in the Americas. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Lindstrom to introduce our speaker for the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Well, I'm very pleased to have with us virtually David Belfon from the University of Toronto, talking about Orthodox Jewish Leaftakers in Toronto. We're very eager to include Canada in our coverage of Jewish life in the Americas. The series you're speaking in is Gale Collaborative on Jewish Life in the Americas. So a little bit about our speaker. David is a scholar of contemporary Canadian Jewish identity, and he's looked into several issues concerning identity change, religious pluralism in North America. He's interested in ecumenicism between Jews and Catholics, as well as the mechanisms through which non-mainstream racial and religious identities are marginalized in contemporary Jewish movements in North America. And his exact specialization, topic of his dissertation, is religious leave-taking. He's had some of this work published in the Handbook of Leaving Religion, published by Brill. And what he looks into is how spatiality facilitates identity change among people who become disaffiliated from Orthodox Judaism in Toronto, the most multicultural city in Canada. And based on the data that he's collected, it analyzes how people who leave Orthodoxy are able to navigate the various identity marketplaces adjacent to mainstream Judaisms. This year, he's the Anne Tannenbaum Center for Jewish Studies and Department for the Study of Religion Joint Postdoctoral Fellow at the University of Toronto. And he's engaging in food and materials cultural studies research on the intersection between Jewish foodways and disaffiliation, looking into how culinary attraction and aversion govern idiosyncratic dietary changes before and after leaving Orthodoxy. So I'm very eager to hear his talk. Where do I go from here? Narratives of Orthodox Jewish leave-takers in Toronto. David.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for that kind introduction and for inviting me to speak today, Dr. Kaplan, Professor Lindstrom, and thank you, Sablin, for coordinating everything for today. I'm very pleased to be with you, and I appreciate everyone's interest in my work. When I ask a study interviewee who I call Esther what life has been like since leaving her Orthodox Jewish community, she describes to me an intensely liminal experience. I feel like I'm in a little bit of a no man's land, she tells me. Most of my friends are either non-Jewish or secular, but I still live at home in an Orthodox community because grad school is expensive. So I feel like I'm not really understood in either world that I'm in. Not a lot of people exist who are kind of floating between the two, still having some kind of deep respect and even love somewhere in them for Orthodoxy, but also hating it so much that you need to get away. And finding some place to exist that doesn't completely reject all of your Jewish identity, and that doesn't completely accept all of what secular society has to offer either. Esther continues, people who are secular are to me like, well, if Orthodoxy causes you so much stress and struggle, and it's clearly harming you, just throw it all away. Get rid of it. Join us in the free society of individuals and individualism. And then the Orthodox side is like, you were raised with this. How could you let it go? How could you abandon the Jewish people? So Esther pauses for a moment. She takes a deep breath and then she says, finally, I still feel very much like I have a foot in two worlds. So contemporary North American Jewish identities are extremely varied, right? Containing identity expressions along religious, ethnic, historical, and cultural lines. These Jewish identities aren't mutually exclusive. Different factors are more prominent than others among the countless characteristics that makes each person who they are. Despite this wide-ranging spectrum of Jewish identities that exist, mainstream Orthodox communities in the Greater Toronto Area, or the GTA, tend to privilege really only one variety of religious identity, right? So this is Jewish beliefs and practices that are in line with the community's strictly observant standards. Some community members find these expectations unworkable, and so they leave Orthodoxy, as Esther did. These leaf takers separate themselves from their mainstream communities by conducting themselves in ways that deviate from observant standards and ways of behaving that are consistent with normative community expectations. Individual accounts of what causes these people to leave vary from person to person, but they generally start by transgressing taboos such as breaking the Sabbath, eating non-kosher food, or dressing in a way that's deemed inappropriate, given the modesty norms of a particular Orthodox community. Disaffiliation could also result from becoming atheist, or disagreeing with other theological issues that are standard to Orthodoxy, to the point where continuing in one's community becomes either undesirable or even seems impossible. Leaving Orthodoxy is colloquially known as going off the derech, which is literally off the path of normative Orthodox observance, the path that everyone in a given community is expected to follow without significantly deviating from that path. Now, despite most scholarly and popular works on the subject of going OTDs being focused on those who are most highly enclaved, the people who go off the derech accounts for some of the most extreme examples of biographical disruption, right? It's the people who drop out. But not everyone who goes OTD is Haredi or ultra-Orthodox. So from Haredim to modern Orthodox Jews to Balei Tshuvas, these are secular Jews who become observant later in life, my research finds that people who go OTD from every corner of the wide Orthodox Jewish spectrum have something to say on the matter. Today, I'll be presenting some of the key findings that form the basis of a book manuscript that I'm currently preparing on leaf takers from Orthodox Judaism in the Greater Toronto Area, which is Canada's largest city and one of the most multicultural cities in the world. It's home to nearly half of Canada's Jews, as of the most recently available numbers. I'll be providing a general overview of what leaf-taking trajectories look like for my sample, each of whom felt compelled to leave their home communities, usually in their teens or early adulthood, though it can happen later on, and each of whom cultivate a different Jewish experience elsewhere, both in terms of geographic difference and social difference, away from Jewish neighborhoods in Toronto and away from the people and institutions that make up these communities. Orthodox life plays out in informal community clusters here. They're generally focused north of the downtown core in the GTA's suburbs through two main Jewish neighborhoods separated by approximately 10 kilometers or about 6-ish miles. And these areas are colloquially known as up north and down south along a corridor called Bathurst Street, rather than in kind of disparate dribs and drabs around the province. It's very kind of central. I'll address a crucial phase in leaf taking during which OTDs occupy a liminal space between mainstream orthodoxy and orthopraxy on one hand, and disclosed marked disaffiliation on the other, a kind of gray area between observant insiderhood and secular outsiderhood. Once they begin questioning their continued observance and membership in their Orthodox communities, I find that leaf takers secretly transgress Orthodox norms outside of Jewish districts in the city. Here, they experiment to see what living off the derech would be like, free or hope mostly free from what they perceive to be constant community surveillance. They then return to their old communities and present as fully observant until their next opportunity to step out again. Eventually, they disclose as OTD and disaffiliate from Orthodoxy once they feel better equipped to deal with the consequences that this revelation inevitably brings. I discovered that leaving mainstream Orthodox Judaism does not necessarily mean leaving Judaism or even stopping all observance. This finding is actually pretty different from how most scholarship has assumed leave-taking from Judaism to function. Most expect it to mean a decisive exiting. I'm finding that it's more of an insider-outsider issue. Now, observant Jews do take leave from Orthodoxy, moving toward a different Jewish expression, but my findings show that the religious path that they pursue going forward remains firmly within Judaism, emphasizing perhaps Judaism's cultural or ethnic dimensions and minimizing or leaving behind certain spiritual or ritual elements, or leaning towards an undefined expression that looks kind of like Jewish humanism, or even an altogether different identity. These leaf takers gravitate towards all kinds of identities that are possible outside of the typical denominational models. But in every case, everyone remains firmly embedded in Judaism, in Jewishness colored by their biographies. These are their histories engaging in mainstream Orthodox Jewish life, informed by the leaf-taking trajectories that their accounts describe. So for my sample, leaving Orthodoxy isn't the end of their identification with Judaism, which is why I choose to call these people leaf-takers, not exiters. I'd like to share a vignette to illustrate what testing the waters of OTD life tends to look like in Toronto. So if you picture this, if you will, a young Orthodox man walks down the street near the intersection of Bathurst Street and Lawrence Avenue in North York, a suburb in the GTA, the heart of Toronto's down south Jewish community. This is a space considered by many locals to be quintessentially Jewish, and it has been since the mid-20th century, when much of the city's observant community moved northward from the downtown Kensington Market neighborhood that had previously been home to most of the city's Jewry. The man looks around. He feels nervous, but he's also feeling empowered. Confident that the coast is clear, he removes his yarmulke, his kippah, and puts it in his pocket. Now he seems effectively invisible. He's just another man on the street. He's not an obviously Jewish or Orthodox person as he appeared to be just a moment ago, as indicated by his standard piece of male Jewish costuming on his head. He's hungry. He's looking for something savory, something with a kick, something different. He knows that walking around without a kippah and eating in a treif or an unkosher restaurant are both blatant, visible transgressions against community standards. But at this point in his journey as an OTD, a person off the derech, the man's been eating non-kosher food for years, and he hasn't been caught yet. He hasn't told anyone either, but he notices how he's become feeling less and less guilty about these transgressions the more he engages in them. He smiles to himself, and he admits to himself that his rabbis were right. It really can be a slippery slope. So despite its taboo nature, he walks into one of the many Filipino restaurants that dot the neighborhood along this segment of Bathurst Street. The man's taking a significant risk, making this gesture of deviance in his home neighborhood in Jewish Toronto, where he's lived all his life. After all, they, the community, the mainstream Orthodox community in this area, know him and his family, and the surveillors, who he calls spies without even a hint of sarcasm, could be in the area. If they see him, repercussions could be severe. Eating non-kosher in his home neighborhood demonstrates shamelessness, among other perceived moral failings of someone who's left Orthodoxy. It establishes that he's not even bothering to leave the district to sin, bringing shame to his family, who will surely hear about this through the grapevine. Riskiness also makes the restaurant transgression more delightful, right? Because it's dangerous, forbidden, and brazen. It's an exciting, calculated risk. So if the man's lucky, he enjoys an inexpensive filling meal, very different from the kinds of burgers and pizza the kosher places sell. So he goes into the non-kosher restaurant, he eats quickly and leaves. Outside again, he looks both ways to confirm that no one he knows is around. Confident that he hasn't been spotted, the man rummages through his pants pocket for his kippah and puts it right back on his head smoothly in one quick motion. He goes about his day presenting as normatively Orthodox, part of the mainstream, an insider. So if the man's unlucky, though, another member of the Orthodox community will see him patronizing a non-kosher establishment. In this scenario, a rumor might start. Up to this point, he's been secretly off the derech, but now the jig is up. The truth is that he's no longer truly observant, and this comes out, word spreads. Classmates whisper about the man's ostensible misdeeds. Eventually, he's summoned to meet with the Rosh Yeshiva, the headmaster of his religious academy, to explain himself. He's informed that he won't be asked back next year. Sure enough, his transgressions also get back to his parents, whose reputation in the community is tarnished. There are uncomfortable confrontations with neighbors and kosher shops, along with a general feeling of resentment and other kinds of interpersonal and intrapersonal frictions that come with leaf takers who become involuntarily outed as OTD. Most of the 20 people I interviewed during my field work told me stories similar to what I've shared in this vignette, either from their own biographies or as a result of rumors that they heard from around town. Things like, I saw so-and-so getting on a bus on Shabbos, on the Sabbath. Is she still frum? She's still religious. Or, I heard that so-and-so's been seeing a girl who's going around in a low tank top. Is he okay? These were familiar questions heard around town, they tell me. Gossiping and word of mouth is a constant source of anxiety for closeted leave takers. And this kind of gossiping is also the primary disciplinary method for misbehavior, given the quite serious repercussions of being caught that make one who gets caught have a life-changing response. So, what is a typical leave-taking trajectory for Toronto's OTDs? Since community boundary maintenance against outside influences is considered crucial to Orthodox endurance, and I don't think this is a situation exclusive to Toronto, this can be especially powerful among Haredi or ultra-Orthodox communities. A rejection of community behavioral standards is everyone's business. So when a person goes OTD, a series of events is set in motion that affects several crucial aspects of the leave taker's social and cultural experiences, in addition to their spiritual transformation away from Orthodoxy, if there is one. Being found out or voluntarily disclosing as OTD is a very big deal for several reasons, especially given the community's opinion that deviant behavior is contagious. And a troublemaker who's permitted to continue transgressing without being stopped will inevitably influence those who are still observant negatively. So people questioning their continued observance and belonging in a community tend to live with one foot in each world, right? It's kind of like a trial run for disclosed disaffiliation that they engage in before diving headfirst into what's a largely unknown world outside of the enclave that they'll likely encounter without a support system. My interviewees relate how efforts to present oneself in a particular light were highly calculated, and they also required constant vigilance. They report to me that their old communities would diligently watch for deviance in their midst. So the closeted leave taker does his or her best to display pious characteristics. This is the front, according to Irving Goffman, that the community audience instantly recognizes as normative and mainstream, and therefore permissible and not requiring closer scrutiny. So they leave them alone. By looking the part at a glance, especially through conventional dress, but also through engaging in predictable gestures and sticking to community expectations by spending time in Jewish neighborhoods, patronizing Jewish businesses and institutions, the closeted OTD proactively disrupts surveillance efforts, appearing unremarkable to anyone concerned with maintaining community solidarity and weeding out deviance. Questioners or undisclosed leave takers avoid conflicts that would result from their nonconformity. But this normative or mainstream self-presentation is a facade, and this is by design. It's a deception. These bracketing efforts allow for freer individual movement and greater personal agency over questioners' own religious journeys once they take their first steps out of the community, exploring different identity marketplaces and transgressing Jewish law elsewhere in the city, outside of Jewish Toronto, or at least in spaces away from their home community in Jewish Toronto. I was told about different participants engaging in up north transgressions when they're from down south because they're not recognized there, right? It's where they will be less likely to be known or less likely to be recognized. They return only when they're ready to resume the appearance of normative observance, concealing their deviance again until the coast is clear and they step out again. I call this period of kind of testing the waters outside of the boundaries of the neighborhood identity commuting. This is borrowing metaphors from sociologist Wayne Breckis's work on typologies of gay identity concealment and disclosure between suburban and urban spaces in New York. So eventually they disclose as off the dare, or they become outed, often as a result of this kind of gossiping within the community due to transgressions that tend to not really stay outside the community view forever. One miscalculation is enough for word to spread in some cases. This outcome prompts an urgent reorienting of their identities. Others disclose their OTD status to family and friends voluntarily in ways that resemble in some respects how an LGBTQ+ person might come out. Family responses vary, and even when there's a period of estrangement, as there often is, OTDs and their families of origin, at least in my study, maintain some degree of contact after this disclosure, even though these relationships are mediated through uncomfortable compromises. OTD disclosure to the rest of the community, however, comes through gesture. It is a deeply performative experience. To come out as OTD to the community, my sample just kind of stopped trying to hide their unobservance. They stop wearing kippahs, they walk around carrying purses and cell phones in public on the Sabbath. They patronize non-kosher restaurants without trying to hide it, and they dress in clothes that the Orthodox community would deem immodest. An interviewee I call Lior told me that his coming out gesture was driving down the street in his home neighborhood down south on the Sabbath, when driving or riding in cars is forbidden, laying his indiscretions bare to his community who are walking to and from synagogue on a Saturday morning. This gesture makes public not only that Lior doesn't keep the Sabbath according to community standards, but also that he doesn't mind knowing that others in the community know that he's not keeping it. It's an extremely loaded gesture, conveying crucial disclosure information that doesn't need to be expressed through speech, only through action in view of an audience who understands exactly what driving on Shabbos signifies. Praxis does all the talking here, right? It suggests a core change in the now disclosed leave taker, signifying the next stage in his leave taking trajectory, and this is readable to the audience. Because reputation and familial standing are of such serious consequence to an observant Jewish family status within a particular Orthodox community, an individual's changed observance has significant social consequences. One 22-year-old woman called Adina relates quite sorrowfully that she sacrificed a lot going off the derech publicly. She lost all of her Orthodox friends and has had very tense relationships with her immediate family, even while emphasizing, though, that the losses have been essentially worth it to engage in a more personally meaningful Judaism for her. Parents, particularly mothers, but not always, tend to struggle with this kind of changed observance, causing ongoing familial tensions, while other OTDs report being pretty pleasantly surprised and by how kind of muted community responses were to their disclosure, as long as they don't flaunt their leave taking gratuitously. If leave taking is flaunted, the reactions tend to be pretty universally negative. My data finds that leave taking is an intricate process that occurs over time, sometimes a very long time. It's based on complex emotional, intellectual, and spiritual factors that vary from OTD to OTD. It's a very idiosyncratic experience, very much informed by personal choice, by particular social dynamics, especially those associated with power and influence in Orthodox communities, as well as intricate mechanics of identity change unique to a leave taker's specific life circumstances. So this is typically where a person's leave-taking trajectory is thought to conclude, leaving community, family, and Judaism behind in favor of the freedoms and possibilities of the secular world. My data shows that something different happens. Not a single OTD from my sample described leaving Judaism behind completely. After secretly transgressing, coming out as OTD or being outed, moving away from the community socially as well as geographically, leave takers don't stop identifying as Jewish or even observant in some cases. This is a finding that challenges the routine assumption, with a few exceptions in the academy, that a binary in which a person is either in or out is the only or even the most standard way to understand leave taking among Orthodox people today. Now, the people in my sample don't deconvert, disaffiliate, or leave Judaism entirely. Instead, they gravitate towards a largely undefined kind of social and religious space, telling me that they discover that there are actually endless possibilities to live Jewishly once they stop living as Orthodox. Post-disclosure, they ask themselves a key question: where do I go from here? They ask themselves other questions too. Do I stop observing Jewish ritual practices altogether? Are some rituals in Jewish ethos meaningful to my self-definition, and do I want to cultivate or reinterpret these going forward? Do I affiliate with conservatism, reform, some other kind of hybridized neologistic Jewish denomination? What are my options for a religious, ethnic, or cultural community now that my old one is essentially gone? Emphasizing perhaps Judaism's cultural or ethnic dimensions aside from its spiritual or ritual elements, leaning towards identifying oneself as post-denominational or some kind of identity altogether. OTD leave-taking possibilities vary, but for my sample at least, they all remain embedded in a Jewishness that's colored by their personal histories engaging in mainstream religious life. So this is one of the main reasons why I prefer to use the term leave-taker instead of exiter. They don't exit Judaism, but OTDs do take leave from Orthodoxy. They generally express kind of an overwhelming sense of relief since leaving, relating a distinct sense of self-liberation and happiness with their greater personal agency. Having been used to living in a community where following orders and engaging in what tends to be rote ritual observances that govern every aspect of every day, this new shift to making countless daily choices, large and small, and decisions for their own lives was very exciting for them, especially for the ones who are kind of newly minted. One participant, Dove, explains his experience in terms of a powerful sense of freedom. He says, when you become not religious, there's a very liberating feeling, especially at the beginning. Like, I can eat at a non-kosher restaurant. I can do whatever I want. His eyes get wide as he says, I still remember. Life is a lot more freeing, and there's a lot less guilt from God, which is great, he says. Now, the vast majority of the people I spoke with reject the usual denominational labels outright, all of them, finding established Jewish classifications hopelessly unrepresentative of a meaningful, personal Judaism. They predict that whatever Jewish experience they'll gravitate towards in the future will be similarly unburdened by the fixed categories that haven't served them particularly well in their Jewish experience so far. Although several people do explore non-Orthodox Jewish streams or denominations, only 2 people in my sample claim to have affiliated with any denomination at all outside of Orthodoxy. Instead, they either don't categorize their Judaism or they only offer a kind of a vague self-description. For example, someone I call Isaac describes himself as Orthodox, but off the derech. He acknowledges that this self-description is pretty oxymoronic, but he insists nevertheless that it's the most accurate label he can think of for where he is right now. He seems frustrated by how hard it is to describe his present Judaism after leave-taking because the existing kind of boxes that he can fit himself into are so limited. I definitely don't feel reform or conservative just because they change certain things that I think are important, he tells me, explaining that leave-taking has reaffirmed his identification as a Jew, even if his status is undefined right now. I think, if anything, this whole thing of leaving has made me realize what's important, Isaac reports. I'm not comfortable saying, for example, I'm not Jewish. Even though I've abandoned a whole lot of the rituals, there's still something that's important for me. Other interviewees describe having a similarly hard time fitting themselves into any established category, regardless of whether these labels are traditional or new. They have largely stopped twisting themselves into knots to fit a rigid category that doesn't accommodate them well, finding their OTD status perhaps actually the most appropriate identifier for the time being. Heshi explains that well-meaning people tend to say he's being too hard on himself when he refers to himself as an Apikoros, which is a heretic. I worked hard for this title, Apikoros. You don't get to take that away from me, he tells me, laughing. I love it. I am that, and that's totally fine with me, he tells me. Speaking to how important the leave taker designation is, another interviewee who I call Ezra relates, at some point, I came to grips with the idea that I'm not just a secular Jew. I am a Jew who used to be in the Orthodox community. So that became a bigger staple in my identity. So you see, being OTD signifies difference from both Orthodoxy as well as being completely secular from the beginning. Leave takers aren't secular Jews, they're formerly Orthodox. And their life histories as Orthodox Jews are essential factors to contribute to who they become after leaving. So following Wade Clark Roof, my work emphasizes the kind of importance of analyzing religion across pre-existing boundaries of traditions and institutions. These OTDs account for themselves by developing a lived religion, an individualized system of Jewish thought, belief, and practice that they find personally authentic. Their stories reveal fascinating and varied dynamics of religious experience, borrowing, altering, and even copying completely certain aspects of mainstream observance. In doing so, they cultivate diverse Jewish expressions. They're working at a Judaism that works for them personally, looking back to their experiences in Orthodoxy as a basis for finding what does work or could work, trying to create something positive out of so much negative in their histories. This approach towards self-determined religion is known by several different terms. Multi-layered spirituality, I like that one. Religious pastiche, code mixing, religion a la carte, bricolage, patchwork religion, cafeteria tradition, religious syncretism, and the list goes on and on. These labels tend to have kind of persistently pejorative connotations. They suggest kind of a listless, unserious person who decides to kind of superficially pick and sample aspects of their religious tradition without any kind of structure. I've heard it referred to as a religious tourist who's committed to nothing and no one. And according to my sample, the mainstream Orthodox communities that they left feel that this personalized Judaism can't possibly be legitimate, and so they quickly dismiss or suppress deviance, pushing questioners out of the bubble and off the derech. Several OTDs suggest that if they'd been granted room to kind of work through these personalized observances, they may not have disaffiliated completely. But they also acknowledge that such a scenario probably wouldn't have been allowed in any community that considers itself strictly Orthodox. That's just not how it works in their experiences. So what do? They reorient layers of the varied religious, cultural, and ethnic touch points that they associate with Judaism, creating an idiosyncratic version. They insist that their post-OTD Judaism is not built on a whim. It's not a lax picking and choosing of easy beliefs and practices that kind of still label them as Jewish, if only but barely. They develop these new Judaisms through an extended period of thinking, feeling, and living Jewishly outside of a normative community and outside of these expectations. So instead of thinking of Jewish hierarchies in the ways that they used to routinely, based on ritual stringencies and kind of holding up those Jews whose observances were more rigorous than everyone else as being the most kind of authentic Jew that one could be, the metaphor of layering and levels make Judaism a personal endeavor towards Jewish authenticity. All interviewees cite their leaf-taking experiences as key determinants to how to live Jewishly today. They wouldn't be who they are without having been raised Orthodox. And even though they left, most of them are pretty grateful for the often extensive Jewish education they carry with them today, religious education, I should say, and work with that education and that knowledge as they continue their journeys, working to create something new, rather than dismantling their Judaism wholesale. This new Judaism usually emphasizes interpersonal uprightness, proper behavior, over an emphasis on ritual excellence. This is about emphasizing being a moral and ethical actor as a Jew, but ritual does have its place for many of these people. They try to separate what they see as the essential from the fundamentalistic, determining for themselves what practices make sense in their own lives now, leaving the rules they deem extraneous, overly cautious, prejudicial, or nonsensical behind. Some OTDs describe their Jewish identity quite narrowly, identifying with particular character traits, some of which can kind of border on stereotypes, embracing them as core features. I like being the funny Jew among my group of friends, Noam relates, explaining that he identifies closely with the cultural institution of the Jew as a comedian, more than any ritual or theological identification. Especially when I became non-religious, I really identified with Woody Allen a lot, and I love Larry David. Noam kind of wags his finger as he tells me that I guess Orthodox Judaism would say, oh, that's just watered down cultural bullshit. But there's something about those comedians that tend to help me with my Jewish sense of self. I don't believe in God, but I'm Jewish, he says. So for Noam, Judaism is about a particular style of humor. It's about references to cultural idiosyncrasies and a recognizable body of arts and culture associated with American Judaism as presented in television and film. But it's not about ritual. Right? Jewish food, especially when focused around a religious calendar, is another way that some OTDs express their Jewishness without emphasizing observance. Leaftakers who do maintain religious theologies and ritual observances kind of rationalize their changes throughout their narratives. They argue that they've been carefully considering whether or not traditional beliefs and observances can harmonize with textual, philosophical, and moral considerations informed by their own experiences and responses to what they've learned through sacred texts and debates. These OTDs embark on a mission to forge a clearer path from their lives, informed by halacha, informed by Jewish law and custom, but not necessarily beholden to it. For example, Lior makes Saturday a day of rest. He refuses to check his email or do anything related to his day job, but this rest sometimes entails violations of halacha, such as driving or using the phone, which aren't in keeping with Orthodox standards of the Sabbath. For him, being Jewish isn't defined by traditional rules, but by his own moods and motivations for what's in keeping with the day of rest on the Sabbath. This is kind of an emphasizing of the spirit of the law, of the letter of the law. Esther wants to find an equilibrium between her social outlook and traditional Jewish sources, but she struggles with texts that are at odds with her social justice ideals, specifically in terms of orthodoxy's issues with homosexuality. She says that if she continues supporting LGBTQ plus people, she can't support the Torah in its entirety. So there's an uncomfortable stalemate. She's refusing to engage in apologetics to say that apparently anti-gay sentiments that seem to exist in the Torah don't really mean that, because she knows their sources and they are problematic in her view. These are examples of how multi-layered Judaism plays out in Leaftaking, indicating how varied and elastic this religious outlook can really be. I'll close with some examples from one narrative that demonstrates the diversity of post-Leaftaking Judaism. According to an interviewee I call Ezra, we see just how much Orthodox Judaism, I should say, can influence a post-Leaftaking multi-layered Jewish identity that remains distinct from it. Having left behind several central normative religious beliefs and practices in his teens, Ezra has since taken on certain rituals common to Orthodox Judaism that feel authentic to him now that he's had the time and the inclination to think through them more fully. In his late 20s now, he keeps kosher for the most part, he observes the Sabbath, and he prays multiple times a day, often even in the synagogue. He also eats vegetarian meals in restaurants that aren't kosher certified. He dates non-Jewish women, and he engages in other activities that weren't acceptable in his old community. Ezra says that he engages in these observances that he does because he's done his reading, and he personally believes that certain tenets of traditional or even Orthodox Judaism are essential, with sound textual bases to support his present beliefs and observances. He insists that he's still off the derech. He tells me that he's, quote, made a violent break with Orthodoxy, and he does not see himself ever coming back. He uses wearing a kippah as an example. Now, Ezra wasn't wearing a kippah in either of the times we met, but he showed me that he carries one in his pocket, and he says he does it all the time. He explains that wearing a kippah isn't as simple as wearing one all the time, as a mainstream Orthodox person would, not wearing one at all, wearing one for identity commuting, or to avoid being hassled by his own community when he goes back to Jewish Toronto, as he does frequently. Like everything else in Jewish ritual life, he tells me how there's been a great deal of historical debate, and debate remains vital to engaging with Judaism meaningfully today. So I quote him at length here. Growing up, I always wore a kippah into high school, even university. At a certain point, when I was distancing myself from Orthodoxy, I was like, I am no longer going to be wearing a kippah. Then when I sort of came back to certain degrees of observance and I was taking seriously the study of Torah, I actually looked into the rabbinical sources on wearing a kippah. I was like, wait a second. The only opinions that say that people need to cover their head, or the ones that I would take seriously, the Rambam, Maimonides, and the Rif, an 11th century halakhic authority, don't align with normative opinions. A lot of Orthodox people would consider other opinions more valid than what I chose. The Rambam says that you only need to cover your head when you're praying. The Rif says the same thing, but he says you only need to wear a kippah when you're praying in a synagogue. Meaning if somebody follows the Rif exclusively, they would not wear a kippah outside of a synagogue, even while praying. I personally follow a more syncretic approach, where I combine both of these opinions together just out of respect for each of them. Both of the logics, in my opinion, are very sound, and it's just a matter of minutia. So I wear a kippah in both of these situations. I do not wear one outside of them. End quote. By doing his homework and deciding for himself which religious laws and interpretations make the most sense, Ezra's constructing a standard for his own kippah wearing that he sticks to consistently, in a manner that distinguishes him from the mainstream community he left, who would see a person without a kippah as off the derech, end of story. Even while his practices do somewhat resemble theirs. He's filtering Jewish law and custom through a rational system based on tradition that makes sense to him. And he tells me, as all of the interviewees I spoke with do, that if other OTDs find that no ritual observances are meaningful for them, they are also engaging in legitimate, authentic Jewish identities, even without any observances at all. Ezra seems to relish the challenge of finding meaning in traditional sources, crafting an observance level all his own. So once they separate from Orthodoxy, OTDs do their best to satisfy what they personally deem to be the core requirements of authentic Judaism, or what characteristics of a sociocultural Jewish identity they find meaningful. They no longer worry about what others think about their Jewish lifestyle, often leaving hope for finding a new community on the back burner, at least for the time being, because no one describes having significant relationships with any kind of church of non-believers, although other studies have identified that these do sometimes exist in the US, especially in online communities of OTDs who are both disclosed and closeted. Everyone I spoke with highlights their desires for greater Jewish authenticity in their lives, which is made possible because they're Orthodox literate. Avi talks about leading his own version of a Jewish life through his plans for a more fulsome Jewish ritual experience with his own family that isn't halakhically flawless, but is quite cultural. Kind of like lighting candles on Friday night for Shabbat. Esther explains that Jewish culture, history, documents, and philosophy are important aspects of the tradition to her present Jewish seeking, while Lior cites Jewish history, especially the Holocaust, ethnicity, Zionism, and culture, as paramount in his post-Orthodox Judaism. Their Judaisms are works in progress, and they tend to be difficult to articulate, as they involve multi-layered experiences, almost always outside of typical denominationalism. My work shows how going OTD isn't a privation from Judaism, at least according to these leaf takers from Toronto. Instead, it's inherently constructive, as OTDs explore the not always clearly defined adjacent Jewish identities that exist among Canadian Jewry. Now that they're no longer under threat of censure, of interpersonal conflict, fearfulness of divine retribution, which laid quite heavily on them before, certain familiar rituals and beliefs take on new power for them to inspire, to reflect, and to grow in Judaism, even though that Judaism is deeply individualistic and different from how they were raised. So a great deal of the leaf takers' religious futures remain unknown, but there's one matter of their identity that all of these OTDs tell me that they feel completely secure about. They remain unwaveringly and proudly Jewish. The people I spoke with for this project on leaf taking are not exes, and they say they never will be. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Many thanks, David. Very good talk. A lot of information that we wouldn't have expected. And you're open to questions, correct?
Yes,
Okay.
I would love to hear some.
Well, actually, I had one, how you made contact with your informants and whether any of your informants were at all suspicious of your motives, that you might be trying to, lure them back into the fold or whatever.
This is a very appreciated question. Thank you for asking it. It was a bit of a journey to arrange this project. I went through the Research Ethics Board at the University of Toronto, where I did my doctoral work. And they were very aware that this is a very sensitive topic, and that aside from perhaps interviewees being scared off from speaking with a researcher about some very personal issues, that their privacy could easily be exposed. So it took about a year to secure ethics approval. I had to submit my questionnaire, methods of data processing to make sure that it would be anonymized sufficiently in the final project. And a key issue was that I wasn't able to extend the invitation for participants myself. I would have to go through other parties. So I kind of liken this to swimming with one arm behind one's back. It's possible, but it isn't that easy. So I had to do a call. I wasn't able to post them in Jewish neighborhoods because that would attract unwanted attention. And I was able to get friends of friends, especially through social media, to forward my information to prospective participants. They would vouch for me that I didn't have any nefarious agendas and that I am a legitimate researcher working on a social scientific project. And those people reached out to me. No one who reached out ended up dropping out of the project, which was great. And eventually when I got a few, they tended to know kind of other OTDs. So through snowball sampling, I was able to get 20 participants, which isn't a huge number, but it allowed me to really get quite deeply into their narratives and to make connections that I probably wouldn't have been able to find with a larger pool. So it ended up working out that way, but it was a bit of a long circuitous process. But from the feedback that I got in the debrief after our interviews, OTDs seemed satisfied and grateful to be able to tell their stories, because as a invisible population, they don't generally shout from the rooftops that they're leaf takers because of the taboos that are associated.
Okay, thank you. And I see we have a question from Jonathan.
David, thank you so much for a really wonderful talk that I think highlights that your research really is moving beyond the sort of binaries of in or out that have sort of dominated these narratives. I think going back to the 19th century, right? And it would be interesting, if people who worked in that material would take some of your insights and go back and reread some of those narratives of conversion or separation from the community through this more nuanced way. I think it'd be fascinating to see what comes of it. One thing that I, had a question about is, some of these narratives of leaving, at least classically that I've looked at in the 19th and early 20th century, have been, more conditioned by the cultural context of Europe and emancipation and those kind of issues. What role do you think the distinctly Canadian and, dare I say, Torontonian context of in which your subjects are living has affected the ways in which they're engaging in the practice of leave taking?
Thank you. That's a very, very helpful question. And this was one of the original questions that I had going into this project. What distinguishes this group, aside from being in technically a different country, from, let's say, Orthodox people in New York, right, where so many other studies are based? And I didn't really have a clear issue because a clear answer, because in a lot of ways they're very similar. The real key difference had to come with the geography of Toronto. Rumor mongering, often called lashon hara, or kind of talking behind someone's back about their religious status, isn't unknown in other strictly Orthodox or really any strictly conservative religious groups outside of Judaism either. But it seemed to be especially powerful, at least based on my reading, in Toronto. It seemed to be the primary mechanism for discipline, to the point where it was the punishment. Having everyone turn against the leave taker because everyone knows their private business and sees them wearing with a bare head for a male as indicating not only an improper practice, but an improper belief, right? It's a symbolic gesture that says everything one needs to know about someone, and to have their reputations tarnished was enough of a reason to avoid it. So what I found was, because there is this up north and down south community, what they would do is they would identity commute between the communities. They would, especially on the Sabbath, in times when they could kind of blend in spaces that would remain separate from their home community. So for example, I had one interviewee from the down south neighborhood, and one can walk 6 miles between the communities, but it isn't done particularly often. So he knew that if he was to hop on the bus up Bathurst Street to the north community, take off his kippah, and kind of stick to the non-Jewish neighborhoods, he could essentially remain, he could be invisible. He could do whatever he wanted. He could hang out with his other OTD friends, and the chances of him being caught would be minimal. And if they were using technology to take a photo, for example, it wasn't going to be very likely to happen. So I think the geography of Toronto says something differently about the process of leave taking. And in terms of how leave taking is kind of received by the community, I would have to do more research on that question. I think it's a very important question, especially how it compares to the States. But just one more point on that question, the fact that this is such a multicultural city means that enclaves are very porous. You will generally see these Jewish neighborhoods, but everyone lives essentially everywhere. We do have little Italies, but there's no like strictly Jewish neighborhood where it's even gated off. There could be a low-rise apartment building for the Colo, but right next to that there'll be a bunch of people from all different ethnic groups. The down south area is very heavily Filipino, as Catholic as well as Jewish, and so it's a lot easier to kind of blend in. But that also means going OTD means the influences of the outside world are much more on display. They're harder to hide, and therefore people get curious.
So do I see any further questions here? Oh, Greg.
Hi, thank you. Perhaps you covered this, but I was just wondering about the impact of skill sets or the absence of skill sets of negotiating life on a decision to become a leave taker or in the process. There was a transition group in Jerusalem, mainly with 16 and 17-year-olds, but they couldn't make change or do laundry, or basic skills. And I just wondered in the Toronto setting what that was like.
Thank you for that very thoughtful question. It really depends. This is one of the findings that I had that kind of reiterated what other studies that focus on Haredim, on the ultra-Orthodox, tend to emphasize, which is that their stakes of leaving are much higher than other Orthodox denominations, even if they're insular. It's not to the degree where it's a totalizing community where there are fewer life skills. The Haredi leave takers who I did interview for this project did tend to take issue with their secular or general studies education. It wasn't perhaps as extreme as not being able to speak English, but only speaking Yiddish, but to the point where they feel that they were very hard done by and that they were kind of set up for failure. They felt that they were trapped so that they could not escape, because if they were, they worried that they would become unhoused, or that they used the word loser a lot. They were told that they would be losers. They would be kind of fall into hard drug use and never make anything of themselves. And on that point, everyone in my sample had accomplished quite a lot. I interviewed doctors and lawyers and graduate students, and some of whom had to get their GEDs because they had almost very little general studies education. There was one participant who said, he's always hated school because even at an early age, he realized we're living in Toronto and we're not learning English, we're not learning French, we're not learning basic math other than arithmetic. And he's tried to return to school several times, but the taste in his mouth of the community denigrating these general studies skills was so powerful, the vestiges were so powerful that he was never able to get over it. So he ended up starting his own business and is apparently quite successful. But yes, I would say for the modern Orthodox or kind of left-leaning Orthodox, it's less of a problem. But for the Haredim, it does persist as a problem among my sample.
Thank you. Bruce, you have a question.
Yes, hi, thanks for the talk. So my question comes out of the American context, and one of the things that has struck me about Judaism is its communal nature and how they participate. These communities participate in rituals together, in celebrations together, whereas when I look at American Christianity, it's much more individualized, and this leads to a splintering of groups and denominations and so on. And when I heard you talk about some of these OTDs who are talking about their own style of Judaism, and you talked about Judaism's plural, it made me wonder, what's the dynamic between a more individualized approach to Judaism and the strong communal ethic that's kind of at the heart and soul of Judaism? And did you detect any tension there? Were they sort of influenced by Western individualism, do you think, in doing this? I'm just curious about that particular dynamic.
Thank you. I'll answer your last question first. I would say that they were absolutely influenced by Western individualism. And I kept hearing a lot of spiritual but not religious, a lot of that kind of talk. And yes, one pattern that I found is this multi-layered Judaism. It's almost like everyone would bristle at the suggestion of becoming denominational again in some other way. But at the same time, they say that they miss going to synagogue and singing with a community. They miss having Passover seders with the family done correctly. They say some of them were very frustrated at kind of like neo-Orthodox reinterpretations of the Seder, even though they believe or claimed that everyone is entitled to practice Judaism or observe in any way that they wanted. But they acknowledge that this is a very kind of individualized and often lonely experience. So what I found that was very striking to me, especially since, the OTD memoirs and, television programs and other scholarship tend to find that people go OTD, they're cut off from their families. Their families mourn them as if they had died. There were some very tense experiences for my interviewees with their families, sometimes years of estrangement, but everyone ended up reconnecting. And the way this reconnection worked is that they would bracket their OTD-ness. They would go back to Jewish Toronto. They would spend Jewish festivals with their parents. They would present as normatively Orthodox, wearing high-cut tops, wearing kippahs, going to synagogue even while their parents know that they don't live that way on their own, even after they're disclosed. And in doing so, they would be able to engage occasionally with a kind of communal Judaism that they miss and that they do find essential, but not to the point where they would need to stay in a community in which they're unhappy in order to have it. So they're kind of having their cakes and eat it too. Now, I was surprised by this finding because so much of their narratives are about authenticity, and this is technically, putting their self-determination on the back burner in order to pretend to be normative to facilitate peace. Nobody seemed to find this kind of disjunctive or disturbing or frustrating. They just said, it's what needs to be done, and it's worth it in order to make peace in the family and to enjoy these communal aspects of Jewish life. So they don't find it outside of Judaism. They find it within the Orthodoxy that they left, but they bracket it to get there.
Well, are there any more questions out there? If not, let me thank you again, David, for a very informative talk. I think we've all learned a lot, and it's given us a lot to think about. And Jonathan, oh, you're applauding. Are you raising your hand or are you applauding? Okay, applauding. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to be here today.